Why has China gone all in on new energy? 10 years ago, few people imagined that China would become the center of the world's green revolution. At that time, it was still mostly seen as the smokestack of the world, burning coal at massive scale, importing oil at record levels, and facing endless criticism over pollution. Western governments pointed fingers, saying China was destroying the planet while enjoying the benefits of globalization. But here's the twist. Instead of being trapped, China flipped the script. Today, it is the largest producer of solar panels, the biggest market for electric vehicles, and a leader in wind and battery technology. The very rules that many thought would constrain China ended up helping it leap ahead. And in a strange reversal, some Western countries that once pressured China on climate have now slowed or even abandoned their own green pledges. So how did this dramatic shift happen? China's modern economy runs on energy, and for decades it had a glaring weakness: oil. By the mid-2010s, China was importing over 11 million barrels of oil every single day, more than 70% of its total demand. And almost all of that came by sea, squeezed through the narrow Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia. Strategists in Beijing called this the Malacca Dilemma. It meant that, in any conflict, the U.S. Navy, stationed in Singapore, Guam, and across the Pacific, could theoretically choke off China's lifeline. Imagine 90% of your energy supply depending on a single foreign-controlled waterway. This was not a theoretical concern. During the Iraq War in the 2000s, and later during tensions in the South China Sea, Chinese state media openly worried, what if Washington really decided to block the strait? Former President Hu Jintao raised the issue in 2003. Xi Jinping later hammered the point home. Energy security is the foundation of national security. The energy rice bowl must be firmly held in our own hands. That fear was one of the seeds of today's new energy push. Energy dependency wasn't just about ships, it was also about money. Since the 1970s, almost all oil trade has been settled in US dollars. That system gave Washington a hidden weapon: financial control. When the US sanctioned Iran and Venezuela in 2020, Chinese buyers suddenly found themselves unable to pay for oil shipments, even when the oil was available. Banks, worried about US penalties, refused to process the payments. It was a wake-up call. Being dependent on both imported oil and the US dollar meant a double vulnerability. This sparked not only efforts to diversify oil imports from Russia, Africa, and Latin America, but also the promotion of the yuan in energy trade. By 2024, about 20% of China's Middle Eastern and African oil imports were already being settled in yuan, a small but symbolic crack in the decades-old petrodollar system. On top of all this, there was moral pressure. By 2020, China was producing 31% of the world's carbon emissions, far above the US at 14%. Western politicians and media held this up as proof that China was the climate villain. At first glance, this looked like a clever lever. As the world's factory, China would naturally struggle to meet strict climate rules. If China had to slow down production to cut emissions, it would give others breathing space. But here's the twist. Instead of being trapped, China used the challenge as a springboard. Beijing poured money into solar, wind, EVs, and batteries. It promised the world that it would peak carbon emissions by 2030 and reach neutrality by 2060. And then it actually started moving faster than expected. The irony is sharp. What was supposed to be China's weakness, its emissions, became the driver for a new industry boom. Chinese companies that once made cheap toys and furniture now make the world's cheapest solar panels and most competitive EVs. Meanwhile, in a reversal no one predicted, some Western governments began backtracking on climate policy. US and European leaders who once scolded China now argue that climate change is exaggerated or not urgent. The roles flipped. The accused became the leader, while the accusers hesitated. China's method was straightforward: build bigger and faster than anyone else. Wind power. By 2024, China's wind capacity reached 450 gigawatts, about 40% of the global total. The Gansu Jiaochuan wind farm alone generates as much power as dozens of coal plants. Companies like Goldwind became global giants, second only to Denmark's Vestas. Solar power. Here, China didn't just participate, it dominated. By 2024, China accounted for 45% of the world's installed solar capacity and exported 80% of all solar panels. Firms like LONGi cut production costs from $4 per watt in 2008 to 15 cents. Entire deserts in Inner Mongolia and Qinghai are now covered with solar farms visible from space. Electric vehicles. In 2024, China sold 12.9 million EVs, more than the rest of the world combined. BYD's Seagull model, priced under $10,000, outsold Tesla globally. With over 14 million charging points, China built an EV network far beyond anything in the US or Europe. Each of these wasn't just a product, it was a strategy to replace oil with electricity, and then dominate the industries tied to that electricity. But wind and solar have one big problem. They don't run 24 hours per day. To solve that, China built the world's most advanced grid and storage system. The state grid operates more than 1.5 million kilometers of transmission lines, including ultra-high voltage lines that move power across provinces the size of European countries. On storage, China is unmatched. Companies like CATL control over a third of the global EV battery market and are pushing new designs, sodium-ion, solid-state, that could further cut costs. In 2024 alone, China added 50 gigawatts of battery storage capacity, about 60% of the global total. Without these investments, the renewable boom would have collapsed under its own intermittency. Another overlooked factor, China controls not just the final product, but the whole chain. Rare earths, 70% of mining, 90% of refining. Solar panels, 80% of global exports. Batteries, 37% of global EV battery supply. This means the world's shift to green energy now partly depends on China's factories and minerals. That dependence mirrors, in some ways, China's old dependence on foreign oil, only now the roles are reversed. Beyond economics, this shift is strategic. By leading in new energy, China weakens U.S. leverage in oil and dollars. It also exports influence through the Belt and Road Initiative. In Pakistan's Gwadar port, Chinese-backed wind projects now supply local electricity. In Kenya, Chinese-built solar farms light up rural communities. For Beijing, this isn't just about profit, it's about building a new kind of global network where energy dependence flows toward China. None of this has been smooth. Early on, poorly planned wind and solar projects wasted billions in unused power. Curtailment rates once hit 17%. Subsidies created a bubble of low-quality EV startups, many of which collapsed by 2020. Mining for rare earths caused pollution and local protests. China often took a move fast and fix later approach. The waste was real, but the direction stayed firm. Behind China's grand strategy were entrepreneurs who turned policy into products. Wang Chuanfu, the electric dreamer. In 1995, Wang was a young engineer in Shenzhen who left academia to start BYD, originally making rechargeable batteries. Few took him seriously when he pivoted to cars. In the 2000s, BYD was mocked as a cheap copycat, but Wang had a stubborn belief: the future was electric. He pushed for in-house battery production, even when investors doubted him. In 2008, Warren Buffett bought a stake, calling BYD's vision bold. Fast forward to 2024, BYD sold more EVs than Tesla worldwide, including the $10,000 Seagull model that flooded global streets. Wang once said, "The best way to predict the future is to build it yourself." That stubbornness turned China into the EV capital of the world. Li Zhengguo, the solar visionary. In 2000, Li was a small entrepreneur in Xi'an, running a quartz processing business. When he founded LONGi Green Energy, almost no one believed solar could beat coal, but Li bet on monocrystalline silicon, a more efficient but harder to produce material. Competitors laughed at his obsession with shaving micrometers off silicon wafers. By 2024, LONGi became the world's largest solar company, cutting the price of solar energy to a fraction of what it once was. Li turned deserts into solar seas and rooftops into power stations. These individuals weren't just businessmen. They became the bridge between government goals and global markets. And so here's the irony at the heart of this story. A decade ago, many in the West thought climate rules would restrain China. Instead, China used them as fuel to build a new energy empire. At the same time, some Western governments, once proud champions of climate action, are stepping back, arguing that the problem is exaggerated or that economic costs are too high. The roles have reversed. The supposed villain is now racing ahead, while the supposed leaders hesitate. China's shift to new energy was never only about saving the planet. It was about survival, independence, and power. From the Malacca Dilemma to the dollar trap, from climate pressure to industrial ambition, every challenge pushed China toward the same solution: build its own path. Xi Jinping's words sum it up: the energy rice bowl must be in our own hands. And now, as China's oil demand peaks, likely around 2027, the real question is, what happens to a global system built for decades on oil and dollars? That story isn't finished, but one thing is certain: the next chapter in energy history will be written in Beijing as much as in Washington.